Welcome, everyone. I think we've still got people rolling in, but I'm going to go ahead and make some introductions. My name is Randall Stevens. I'm with a company called AVAIL. We're the ones behind this, putting out this tech stack survey late last year. But we'll do some introductions here in a minute. But I've pulled together a merry band of industry experts who are kind enough to join today. We're going to try to do kind of a roundtable style, just conversation around what these results mean. I think there's a lot of us that can take a lot of different things from it. But I've got Corey Rubadue, who's the CEO of ArchVision, and Aaron Vorwerk, who is AEC team lead at Egnyte, and Dan Monaghan, who's got a new gig coming, which is, I can't say, but he was formerly with Chaos. I was gonna say, between Dan and Corey, they've forgotten more about visualization tech stack than the rest of us will ever know. So it's good to have them on the call. Nick Kramer, our token practice leader, because we wanted somebody to come on here and wear the hat of what does this look like and mean inside of a firm. And then the ever evasive Scott Davidson, who what biz dev is that's your official title, but he's the man at McNeel Associates behind all things Rhino. So obviously a big part of the ecosystem. So this is going to be hopefully a fun conversation. So let me just kind of get through the first part so that we can dive into these conversations. But I'm going to give you just a little bit of overview about what this Confluence initiative that we're doing is, what this survey, how it came about. We'll get into this roundtable discussion here amongst the group. And then I'm going to tell you about some future things if you want to get involved or think that these things are interesting. Throughout this, we'll be monitoring the Q&A. So if something that we're talking about or you've got some comment, go ahead and put it in the comments. We won't wait till the end. If we see something that, as we're trying to have this conversation, we'll try to weave this stuff into the conversation. So AVAIL started this Confluence events. We think of it as professional development. So we do a lot of our kind of outreach through professional development, not necessarily something about our own software products, but just trying to be an active part of the community and a good steward of information. It's information that we need to understand in order to develop good products. And then ultimately it lets us interact with, both technologists and the people using these technologies in the AEC industry. We do that a couple ways. Like I said, we do professional development events. I'll show you a couple of events that we do, live events. And then we've always had this interest in higher education. How do we, help the next generation as they're coming in to this into this AEC world, be better prepared. Over the years, we've had hundreds of different companies, like I said, both on the technology provider side and practitioner side, participate in these live events that we're doing. Our kind of premier one that we do is every fall in October. AVAIL's headquartered in Lexington, Kentucky. So we actually have figured out how to convince. Last year we had about 70 people come to Lexington. It's an invite-only event, but it's all around technology leadership in the AEC industry. Everybody on this call has been to one or more of our events. They kind of get the gist, but we theme them every year. And this past year, this is going to tie into why the tech stack survey, the conversation over this past year has been, hey, we've got a lot of applications. Are they talking to each other? Can we get more out of them? Where should the industry be thinking about working on improving communication and the workflows across these different, what can be a complicated set of tools. So this is just a pick from that last event, but we actually do all get together, and that fall event, we spend 3 days in good conversations with some good social time in between, getting to know each other and having, these conversations. Just to get into this survey, last fall with that theme coming up for our October event, we decided to launch a tech stack survey so that we could begin to kind of do an inventory of what pieces of software and how many are firms actually using. The survey ended up, we had 115 participants. I'll show you just a little bit of a breakdown in that. It was pretty simple. It was a little bit long because we had over 400 different applications listed, and we're basically just asking, let's just do an inventory. How many of these are you using? And the only other nuance was that we ask for each one that you are using, rated on a scale of 1 to 5 on, I'll just call it broad penetration. 5, everybody's using it, as deeply embedded. 1, it's here, but maybe it's, that was as simple as we could kind of do a survey and capture that. I think what everybody will find is that just even with that information, there's a lot of nuance that can be discerned from these survey results by just asking those 2 questions. Which applications, what kind of applications are there, and how deeply are they being used inside of your respective firms? Those 400 plus applications, I'm sure we didn't have them all listed, but we did our best to kind of get a good overview of that. They were broken down into 20 different categories. So when you do download and get the finished survey, which is about a 70-some page product, you'll be able to see that we broke these down into some logical categories. All this came about for years. The last few years, I would, on lots of calls with people, say, all of our customers are using between 100 and 200 different applications in their software stack. And, for a lot of people, that's like, really? There's that many? And I was on one call earlier in the year where somebody from one of our customer firms said, just as a reminder, I'm managing 180 different apps inside this firm. And I'm just like, wow, this is kind of crazy. It really is a lot of software and a lot of different tools. That's where the survey was born. So with that being said, I'll just give you a couple of highlights, and then we're going to kind of dive in with this group here to dig into what all this stuff means. But like I said, we had 115 participants. This is the firm size. So that was one of the questions. What size is the firm? And you can see about 3/4 of them were, more than 100 employees, and 1/4 of them were more than 500 employee size firms. So we got a pretty good representation, at least of the larger firms. Not as many smaller firms were filling this out this year. As we do this now annually, which we plan to do, I think we'll broaden this and get better and more accurate snapshots as we move. But this is what it looked like this year, and I think it's at least a good enough snapshot to start to have us all poke holes in it or ask questions. So I'll just get to to answer the question: how many apps? The median across those 115 was 87 different applications that they said that they were using. When you went to the 500 plus size firms, that number was 105. This graph is showing you the range of answers from firms in that size. So you can see some had as many as 200. And you can see this kind of sweet spot here is 100 to 200 or 100 to 150. And then that was the median number. And you can imagine, makes sense. The bigger the firm, maybe the more diversified the work that they're doing and the more tools that are there. I'll also just go ahead and say this is probably by definition underrepresenting the firm's software stack, because this was a single person filling these out, and they're likely to not even know, everything that's in use. So I think there'll be opportunities for us to improve on this over time, and with your all's help, get better and better information. I'm just going to kind of tee up one thing that was interesting to me that we can use as part of this conversation. We kind of put this out. A lot of different firms were responding to it. There was clearly, though, there is a clear difference when you start to look at architecture practices versus engineering firms. And so this looks busy, but let me just try to explain it. This is a scatter chart that's showing on the x-axis what would be considered deeply rooted tools. So when I said that we asked them to rate how deeply these tools are used, you can see along that x-axis they had to score 3 or more to show that they were deeply in deep use. And then on the y-axis, there's actually a subset of these tools that weren't the major platforms. So not Revit, not MicroStation, AutoCAD, but the visualization stack tools and the workflow tools that we use on top of those major platforms. There was just a raw count. And so the blue dots are architecture firms. The orange dots are purely engineering firms. And what you can kind of see is that the engineering firms tend to have more deeply rooted, fewer tools, more deeply rooted, whereas in the architecture practices, there tend to be a lot more what we're referring to as point solutions that are used to solve certain problems, but they may not be being used by everyone. They may just be being used by a handful of people to solve certain problems. So I just think it's an interesting part of the conversation to maybe over time look at the difference between, how engineering firms have typically solved some of these problems, how architecture firms, and, it could just be that they're completely different problems being solved. And, but the software and the software stack is going to look different amongst those. All right, so I'm going to let me kind of tee this up, and I want to hopefully quit talking as much and let these other guys start to kind of riff on some of this. But, one of the ways to look at so many different applications that are in use inside of the firm is to think about that you could claim that they wouldn't be being used if they weren't helping to solve some problem. So there is some value that's there. But if you think about the flow and the process that has to go in across these projects on an ongoing basis, you're maybe paying the price at the seams. Where's the data handoff? Where are the places where by having other point solutions, it's just creating more friction, is the way I would refer to it in these workflows. So do more tools mean that there's more handoffs, which means there's more rework going on or lost information as things are flowing back and forth. As I put here, are there failure modes? People can't find it. Either they can't trust it. They know it was done before and they can't find it and reuse it, which is a lot of what the world that we live in with content management. But, how do you keep these things accurate and these teams, engaged in these workflows? So if there is a high cost in these seams, of which part of the survey asks, where do you have the most friction in these workflows? I highlighted a couple of those, but we can turn this conversation into any. But modeling to visualization is definitely one of those. There was a high number of apps that are used in those visualization flows. Going from modeling to visualization and that back and forth, right, we all know can be tedious and cumbersome but is a big part of what firms are engaged in. And then ultimately, as Aaron and I both kind of live in this, content, file management, governance, cloud, not cloud, on-prem, all of those kinds of things, and where data is. I didn't pull it out to put in this slide, but I think that the average number of different places where information lived across that survey ended up being about a dozen. So you can imagine that's also part of the complication is where are we storing our information? And then for a user, what does it mean to get back to it? So with that, I don't know, Dan, Corey, do y'all want to have any comments about on the visualization stack, just, with both of y'all having your heads in it for so long?
I think I'll kick it off, Corey, but and thanks, Randall. I think that just in looking at this survey, there's just kind of this general problem. I think the survey points it out, which is that today that on the design side, design firms are moving to, what the survey called, platform-centric ecosystems, right? And then these ecosystem require core foundation application, or what the survey calls a hub, right? But then these hubs don't solve the entire problem. So then the firms are forced to kind of add these specialized applications to fill the gap. So that's, I think, what you mean by the seam and then the fringes. And then this gap filling, I was thinking about it as kind of an interesting problem because these gaps are created for because of these needs for these additional workflows. And as the survey showed, these firms are constantly creating manual workarounds to move information between their different software tools. And these manual workflows are really, they're created to overcome gaps. So there's this constant temptation, I think, for a design firm to always buy that one more tool to fill that gap, to create the ultimate workflow for those firms. So I think that's one of this data gap is really one of the reasons why in architecture we're seeing so many software applications being used as they're trying to fill these holes from the core application.
Yeah,
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Dan, I'll just say that, that theme for Confluence last year was, do you have to have a gap tool if the other two tools knew how to talk to each other or better shared information, right? And
Yes.
that was part of the goal, is like, can we figure out where those are and get, you don't want to go add a third thing to solve the problem of, I just needed these two things to talk to each other. So
Then bringing this back to visualization, I mean, I think that was why Enscape was so successful, because it didn't create a gap, right? You could be using your core application, you push a button, and then you get out a very reasonable result, and you can continue to get your work done. And then as the visualization software has, or the needs of the visualization requirements for the design firms have changed, now the question is becoming, is Enscape good enough, right? And when it's not, it's now creating another gap. So do you have to add another application? Do you have to use V-Ray? Do you have to use another real-time rendering program, Twinmotion D5, to get that extra level of quality? When you're moving from a real-time program to an offline rendering program, what does that mean for your assets? Corey and I were talking about this on Friday. Can you use the same asset in Revit that you use in Enscape, that you use in V-Ray, that you use in T5, that you use in Twinmotion, the same materials? So these are all kind of workflow gaps in visualization that are causing this extra software to be added to the stack. So one of I think the trends that we're going to see is, particularly in the visualization side, is more integration. You're going to see this on the chaos side, by linking programs together. And then you're seeing this on the D5 side by actually creating monolithic applications, D5, that can handle both the plug-in real-time rendering and then also the more advanced real-time rendering. Corey?
Scott, you own an entire ecosystem. Not own it, but participate in it.
Yeah, I think that the problem, one of the problem with the gaps is a lot of times the gaps are trying to overcome what one model versus another model needs, a representation. So visualization is a good example that you may not model everything, and you might use bitmaps to represent it, but you go to something like specifications, you need all that detail. At least you need the data for that detail. And so one of the things that I've always kind of struggled in this area with, and Rhino does this a million different ways. Grasshopper, is essentially allowing you to rewire the data as it flows through. But how it's like, it's this idea of representation of the data in a way that can I don't know, be detailed when it needs to be detailed and be not so detailed when it doesn't need detail. And so we'll see multiple models. I guess that's one of the things, so what we see in ours is we'll see multiple models that hopefully have some level of syncing, so Rhino may have a model. Of course, we can push that into Revit, but Revit has a lot more sophisticated way of representing some of those things. And then it needs to be dumbed down for like a simulation because of size or whatever it might be. And so one of the things that this idea of gaps to me is almost like a translator and sometimes it's more detailed, sometimes it's less, sometimes it's, and so that's, how do you keep all that synced up with the same and make sure the data's good data that you're using, based on where the project is.
Well, I think the data is the key point there, because where we are now, especially with AI and ML, is more we want to maintain the data. We don't necessarily care as much about the visualization in a really broad sense of the term, as in like a PDF or a rendering or a 2D, axonometric or whatever that's on your sheet. We don't care about the visualization. We care about the continuity of the data. And I mean, if you go back to when was it that Autodesk came out with the ADSK file format, like 2012 or something like that? Yeah. They had this idea that like, oh, we're going to have one file format. And if you want to render it, it's going to basically open up in the 3D Studio Max environment. If you're going to model, it's going to be Revit. If you're going to detail, it's going to be CAD. And I was like, that's really interesting. But then at the end of the day, in order to facilitate that, ADSK was a zip file, right? So it was like an idea before its time. And now we're trying to get back to that same place of how do we get the data to go between platforms? So the data is, when I point at this tree in a drawing, I want it to be, tree 1. When I render it, it needs to render as tree 1. When I go to get quantities and connect it to my specs, it needs to be tree 1. How do you get all that connected? And right now, I mean, Grasshopper is a good, bad example of like how we use that as a hacky workaround to go, well, this thing doesn't talk to that thing. So I'm going to build a Grasshopper, a Dynamo script to try to pass information. Oh, but by the way, Revit reads that as a text field. There's no dedicated field in Rhino, and my specs over here are trying to go to a uniformat master format number, which is not really like a number in a normal sense because it's 1.1.1.1, which is basically text. And so just like none of it really translates between everything. And the challenge is we don't really understand what good data is to begin with, so we can't even articulate what we want from vendors. My experience for the last, trying to work on the data problem at LPA for the last 3 years. That's my take as a, what did you say I was, Randall? The token, I don't know, token something.
You're wearing you represent all practice on this panel.
And I think that is also kind of Scott, to play off Scott and Nick, that's just on the design side. I think that there's another breakdown that happens in the data when the design data meets, the project management data and the ERP system data, right?
Yeah.
And this is another point in which you have this rich model information that almost has to be flattened out into a spreadsheet or some type of data field for an accounting or some type of analysis. In that survey, I think almost half of the firms were doing this through manual workarounds, and that results in the constant friction as you're kind of keeping business records in sync with actually what's happening on the design side. So
we had I'll interject here in real time. Alex asked that he noticed in the survey that we had put design CAD and modeling tools into one category. And he said that the biggest gap we face in architecture is the gap between design, Rhino or SketchUp, and documentation in Revit, lumping them together. And I mean, that was just us making a big giant bucket of places that you create information. But maybe you got some thoughts about that.
Well, Scott. It's not just in architecture people have that struggle. This idea that and I mean, one of the reasons people use Rhino is you don't know if it's a wall or a window or a form or a shape or an idea behind a space or the way sound waves move across the site or something, right? I mean, shape and form and can all works together early on. And then all of a sudden, as you get closer to needing to document this thing, the thing does become a wall. And based on other information coming in from the design, now it's a brick wall. And it's, now and our minds, just quickly can switch on that right away. And it's a little bit more difficult than to say, okay, now I have to take the time to get that into, let's say, Revit, because Revit wants to know exactly what that thing is, which is great, right? It's just such a something that our minds can wrap around so quickly. And I would say that all markets, all professions, really struggle with this and have, whether it's mechanical or marine or architecture. Architecture just, have the models tend to be really sophisticated and complicated. And so that's an interesting, I would break those two apart. And because we've never really been able to do a great smooth job of transitioning between those two. Bespoke, you know, bespoke solutions can do it. But that's a really big challenging problem. And so I would say that from a survey point of view, it probably is a good idea to break those two parts of the process apart.
We will learn a lot from doing it this year, already have. And for those of you that, when you do download the survey, you'll see at the very end of it, we're going to have a form or a place where people can go and give us recommendations about how to, improve that over the next year. So love that kind of input on this.
Yeah, I think there's an industry-wide segmentation. It's not really a bifurcation between design, documentation, construction, and operations. So if we really want to hit bigger,
Yes.
then we need to be able to understand the challenges between I don't know, probably dating myself, Revit and Navisworks and Navisworks and Maximo, or whatever, right? Because it is handing that information off between things. But I would also say that we should look at maybe it's wide swaths of the industry. So LPA does pretty much anything except infrastructure. So infrastructure is different, if you're doing highways and dams and water treatment plants and stuff. But for what we do, we kind of software stack bifurcate into buildings or sites. So the sites group is landscape and civil, and they're a CAD Rhino heavy workflow, versus buildings is a Rhino medium to a Revit heavy workflow. So for us also, for that translation between data, I mean, obviously you have specifications and renderings and other things, but it's also translating back and forth between those two core systems, which is the sites and the building parts of things, which is a big challenge that my opinion, because I'm part of the people that made this opinion, is that we're approaching it the right way versus a lot of other architects and landscape architects are approaching it the wrong way. The wrong way is when the architect is in charge and tells the landscape architect to use a tool because it works better for the architect, not better for the project of the landscape architect. We're trying to come up with workflows and that work best for the discipline, but ultimately the client and the building. And that's why, we're one of those 200 software firms, because we do challenge. We just had somebody come up and, hey, we want this new lighting program. Are you getting rid of an old one? What is it for? Why do we need to do it? So we will have those conversations, but if they come back well, we have to do this lighting analysis in a wet lab for this, and then this is the only way to do it. Well, that's the only way to do it. If that's the right tool for the job, then that's what you have to facilitate. So the portfolio does open up when you use the right tool for the job, as opposed to I'm really good with the hammer, so everything's a nail.
Or you unmuted a couple of times. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I was working with a customer this morning, and I have to say, it never ceases to amaze me how the same problems exist today that were there in 1999 when we were doing projects and using AutoCAD and paper. I mean, going back to this failure modes and can't find it, can't access it. How do you have to rebuild things to get back to a level set on whether it's visualization or even door schedules and window schedules and things like that are shared between consultants and disconnects in the data. I got a list today of 200 files that were all missing textures from a visualization project between Revit, Rhino, SketchUp coming into Lumion as an example. And these files were from, at a user level, I think I counted 10 different users. I don't even know who the firms were or who the people were, but I could tell that there were at least 3 companies involved with the files that were part of the missing data set. And I try to wrap my head around this for a second and go, how is all this stuff still disconnected in this day and age? It's mind-numbing to me. And this is just one facet, one project, and maybe 5, 6 different companies working on the same project altogether. And I'm talking about one particular output here of doing some renderings in Lumion, and I can only imagine what's left to be found and can't be trusted, and so on and so forth, in the rest of that project. At the end of the day, it's mind-numbing.
Maybe that's a good kind of transition. Aaron, I'll let you kind of talk about how you are thinking about single source. I talk about single source of truth. Like, a lot of the big problem is you end up with copies of this stuff, and then I think related to what you were talking about, Nick, with the ADSK lib file, like, is the goal to continue to like take loose content, zip it up, and pass it around? Or is there a future where basically I always think about files as little databases, that those little databases should just live somewhere and you should just be pointing to them, right? And leave them. Don't make copies, because as soon as you make a copy of a database, you're screwed, right? You can't keep it in sync. So any thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, first, the seams idea is applicable across industries, like Scott said. We see it life sciences, financial services, media and entertainment, high tech, high security, et cetera. But it's also applicable across like the project and non-project construct, right? Your firm ideally exists before, during, and after your projects, if you're any good at it. And then, as Nick was talking about, these handoffs, like, how do you govern across the divide? So this takes us in a little bit different direction, but you do have govern on the slide, so I'll take license. But yeah, I care less about where stuff is stored, right? It's more about understanding what it is, classifying it, tracking it wherever it goes or lands. And ideally, that has to happen before you leverage that historic data to generate new things, right? And throughout. So we talk about the fuzziness that happens there in data ownership, like the points all of you have made about visualization, for example, point to valid use cases for specific information at specific times or for specific use cases, but you need to be tracking it, throughout. And right. So it's really about this, needing to establish like this digital foundation, however you want to go about approaching that, particularly in this era of automation or like wanting to leverage AI to do things, right? We get focused on, like, as you talked about, all these tools in the front end of design, right? There's so much energy going into that creative spark that represents 5% of what you're going to get paid on. There's so much more to executing that project. And then, and of course, we get pulled in to use all the shiny objects, right? We want to try out all these things. They have potentially valid, benefits. So how are we then, getting the data right going into those things such that we get, non-hallucinogenic results?
Yeah, the kind of just to add on to that, one of the things that we've found is a big challenge is actually determining what good data is. And there's a lot of, I've talked to a number of startups who their solution is like, well, just give us the folder that has all of your quote unquote good data in it, and we can, produce renderings for you or proposals or whatever. I'm like, I don't have a folder with all of my good data. Oh yeah, every firm does. I'm like,
don't you wish you had that?
I don't know.
The gold leads or whatever they are.
But then like so that's, one example, like, I think we all know, we've been around the industry long enough to know that like it requires tribal knowledge to know like, okay, well, if Nick touches the file, then don't use that one. And Aaron always puts the file over here. Corey only sends it in an email. So like, where is the actual good file? But then on top of that, like we going through this data discovery, we found out that one of our teams was like, they couldn't have tried harder to make things less data. They added 10 parameters to objects so they could schedule them. And in one project, it's a count, and another one, it's static pressure drop, and another one, it's like, and so you could compare all those things together, and you would just get garbage. Sometimes it would be first name, sometimes it would be last name, sometimes it would be an address. Like, it's just like, you can't use that for anything. But we're so used to looking at the data is that actual final PDF. Well, it looks fine on the schedule, so why does it matter? And it's this massive change in where hopefully are not always going to be a paper-driven industry, but we can start to drive value out of other things. And so I think it's the challenge of like, we have all these pieces, these applications that are passing data back and forth, but it's also the opportunity of, if we can standardize that data, we can get more value out of it. And I think everybody on here in some way or another is a software vendor except for me. So maybe stick your fingers in your ears. But the architects and engineers should not be giving all of our data and should not be trusting all of our data to any one vendor. If you think I'm going to live in the Autodesk ecosystem or the Egnyte ecosystem or the AVAIL ecosystem and it's going to be perfect, you're setting yourself up for failure.
It brings up one of Gregory, who put in our Q&A, said, I feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over. Single source of truth. The problem is that we don't hold users accountable. So Nick, how much of that, I think that's related to what you were just saying, which is now you've introduced something. Can people follow the rules? Because I hear that all the time too. Whenever I'm talking with customers, they're like, we try, but we can't get them to do it, right? And how big is that a problem, and what's the root? What do you think the root of that is?
In some ways, I hope that AI can help us with that and like get people to follow some of the standards, but we also have to prove value before people change, because nobody's gonna change. And like, we do a lot of work with what we would look at like as a challenger or a level 2 data use case with Revit Health now, where at LPA, the technology team is called Inspire Design. And our design technology group gets like proactive responses that said, hey, there may be an issue with this project. Project team doesn't take care of it. A ticket's created. Somebody jumps in and fixes it. That's, I don't know, 8 years worth of work to get to that point. But when we started looking at that, Bill DeBevick and I went to a user group, and somebody was like showing their awesome Dynamo graph on a 15-foot screen. And every node was about the size of like, an inch by 2 inches, and it was full. And I was like, okay, we're going to run this, we're going to put this over here and do all this. And like, okay, so who pays for that? Oh, the project team has to do that. Did they get any extra fee? No. What are you doing with it? Well, after we collect a year's worth of data, then we're going to go back and look at it, and then we're going to tell them what they should do with it. No one's going to do that. No one's ever going to say, do extra work for the next year, probably not even a month, and then trust you that change is going to be valuable. So how do we start to show them the carrot of the value proposition to get them to change? And then hopefully AI can start to, and all these other database tools can start to surface things. And I mean, some of it is like, we're looking at data governance. So how do we actually go in and say, this needs to be a number, that needs to be an integer, like very basic things like, are you allowed to have a fractional employee? Yes or no? Okay, yes. So your employee is a number. They're not an integer. Because if I only work half time, I'm 0.5 of an FTE. But you can't have somebody write in 0.5 FTE and then expect to calculate that across anything. So there is some data governance, but a lot of these reporting tools should be coming back and telling us where the issues are. And I don't know if anybody has some magic platform that does that for, whole project, application ecosystems, but that would be interesting to see, because that's where we really struggle. Is the design data is non-structured. ERP, CRM data is structured.
So I saw you unmuting Scott here, but Sean in the comments said that he does, that the single source of truth might not be the right way to think about it. It's more of you need a common data environment that way they can, because you can't keep everything all in one place. So like, what are the rules, I guess?
This sounds crazy, but the more I look at this, part of it is I like that idea of perhaps not a single source of, actually you could say, let's say it's a single source of truth, but it may be some subset of the actual project data is this quote single source of truth. Because what I'm also seeing is, and you talked about trust, what I'm also seeing in a number of places is, as an architect, I have, a whole bunch of data. But the structural engineer, for instance, really only needs 20% of that. And in fact, they really only want 20% of that. And then they are going to add, another 80% of their, another 80% on their side of their data, which they don't necessarily want to share. And I don't want to see it. I want the results of all that data. And then, as you go down the way, you get to shop drawings, right? And so the shop drawing people just want just barely enough data so that they can figure out how to build, the information they need to build however their machines work. And each fabricator is different because they may use different methods. So they actually need different data. And so in some ways, this idea of having single source truth and trying to pile all the data into one place might be part of the problem. How do you get, these people to have their data, protect their data, be able to trust their data? That data doesn't change unless, it runs through their level of expertise. And so do we get back to this idea of, early on, you see the sawtooth of, we'd do a model, we'd get drawings, right? And then we'd send it on the next person, we'd lose data. What would happen if we do that? What happens if that's actually how it needs to work from a digital point of view, but the reason you're quote losing data is you're just dropping off the data that the next step or the next 4 steps doesn't need. You're holding on to it yourself. But
I guess whenever I think about single source of truth, I'm thinking about an individual piece of information, not necessarily not all the information in one place.
Right.
The reality is there are purpose-built publishing tools that are good at certain pieces of it. And you end up, usually by definition, that information is going to live in different places in different systems. Then the challenge, but you don't want copies of that stuff. I want that to be the single source of truth for that piece of information, but I've got to connect it to these other, these things all get connected now. Publish them where they are, but don't make copies of that stuff, because that's when it all gets out of sync, and then you don't know, right, which is the right one or what's the right copy. So
I would agree with Randall. Like when we talk about single source of truth, it is for a set of metrics, not for everything. And that in an ideal world, the project number is generated in our ERP system. And then when you look at it in Revit, it's just reporting that. You can't change the project number in Revit. So you need that type of relationship where there is a source of truth. This is the project number, and other things are reporting. So Revit speak reporting parameters type of thing. It becomes a really complicated mess when you get into certain things, but like I think everybody's got some sort of whatever you want to call it. We call it design narrative, but it's just like all the information about a project in one place. So, what market segment, what discipline was it in? How big was it? When was it built? Where is it? What awards did it win? What was the EUI, steel tonnage, AI 2030, MEP 2040, whatever? All that stuff is in one place. But at the end of the day, that should be a report. You should be pulling that out of the ERP. You should be pulling it out of whatever you're doing your energy model for, whatever you're doing your structural model for. You shouldn't be doing what I refer to as monkey typing, because it used to be like, you get a markup and it was monkey see, monkey do. So you would like look at the markup and go, oh, they marked this off on the door schedule, this, and then I type it over here, and inevitably I missed something. I end up in the wrong place. So then you would set it back and they would mark it up a second time, fix all the things that you screwed up. Like, we don't want that monkey see, monkey do work. We want things to have a single place and other places report from it.
Makes sense. Gregory paid you a compliment here, Scott. He said he agrees with CDE. He thinks a single source of truth as a subset versioning within the CDE. Scott's on point with subsets of data is what I believe Autodesk Data Exchange is supposed to do for us. What's his comment about that?
I think that's actually a good example where the data exchange model is actually simpler than some of the other tools we're using. And I think we can use that to advantage. Now, taking simpler data and then syncing it to our more complex data, that we hold within each silo, let's say, that gets a little more complicated, but it's an interesting problem.
I'd also say now CDE can be used formally. Like, we support a lot of customers in the UK or other places where that, has a formal connotation. But I was responding to a couple of those too about how that's usually used in a project-centric context, and it's claimed by some, like Autodesk tries to claim CDE for docs or something, but really it's bigger than that. And then below, or even bigger than that, is kind of enterprise data management, which is more than just on one given project maintaining a CDE.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, Sean made a comment that subset nets up to the total package, between like Rhino and Revit. Why not just build parts that Rhino does well or SketchUp does well, and then parse those parts, into the Revit, and then it's not a single source of truth, but you're, I think, beginning to build up that value chain. It sounds like, between these.
You guys are talking about it in all these different comments. You guys are talking about it, and then all these posts, right? So exchange, connectivity, bridges, like things need to talk to each other, right? That's what we need here.
Mm-hmm.
Bridge. And then Ron was just reminding that there are, key silos for different kinds of data. Deltek for project info, I think what you were talking about, Nick, and ACC for production and CA management.
Isn't it Forma now? Everything is
it's
Forma?
March.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, next week.
Yeah.
We've got that. And then
it's not BIM 360 anymore. Oh wait, that was 21.
Yeah.
No, Project Skyscraper.
2015.
Yeah, I just changed this slide. I think we're dancing around this too, but we are talking about data that's coming across these different tools. What does that integration work with? How do you govern that to know if you've got the right info? How do you connect those things? Standardize information on these handoffs, right? And critical ones, right? Maybe it's not every tool, right? I don't know that you're ever going to get all 150 of those, in perfect sync, but there's got to be some core ones where that's the primary workflow and the primary, data management and versioning of this stuff. All right. Any last thoughts? We've got like 10 minutes to kind of wrap up here. I'll just put out, Sean, wasn't ignoring you. Sean asked the question earlier from the survey whether or not we were counting bespoke apps, like how many apps are being generated, by firms. We did capture write-ins. We didn't really report on that, but that was one. And I think, moving forward, there'll be better info that we can get on that front. There's going to be a lot to dig into. There was also very early, we did this basically survey started 6 months ago, collecting the data. So things like how fast AI is moving around some of this stuff, I think we might even do a mid-year little mini report and just watch. I think over time, watching the trend about what's happening will be insightful if we can start to collect that info and data for everyone, or and report it back out. But yeah, any other thoughts or
I want
comments?
to throw this out probably for Nick to respond to first, but I think we haven't even really scratched the surface of all the technology that was discussed today, but there's plenty of tech, in my opinion. I think where we struggle and where a lot of these problems are solved is in the people and process part of the conversation, and process in particular. Like if you don't have a strategy, like, as a firm, how could you possibly do any of these things?
Yeah. So, Wendy Rogers, excuse me, is our CEO and also our chief talent officer, and her and I kind of go back and forth, and we have a saying, technology is easy, people are hard. And then the thing that we've been talking about for the last year has been process over product, because people keep coming in going, oh, I want to use Midjourney, blah, blah, blah. Like, well, why? How does Midjourney make you better? Well, it generates images faster. Why do you need more images? Well, because we're on a proposal. Okay, but why is more images better? Why is that a good thing? Like, can you actually show your process and say, this is where our challenge is, so we need this solution? Because early on, we allowed AI image generation into some of our quick burn projects. We have some projects, the one team that does their projects as short as an RFP, request for proposal, on Monday, and drawings are due on Friday. And as long as 3 months between those things. Like, oh, we need to be able to generate out mood boards, quote unquote, mood boards faster. So they generated out what they said were mood boards. Well, the client took those as material boards, and all of those materials didn't exist because AI made something up. Or it was like, here's this, Italian marble that is, $10,000 a square foot. And that's the product. That's so you can do your countertop or the rest of your entire building. What do you want to do? So we're really looking at process over product and people over technology, because how you use the technology is the amplifier. And if you don't, like, I use the analogy, like, oh, you just go out and buy a new nail gun, doesn't make you capable of framing a house. You can probably just shoot nails faster, which is probably not a good thing. So yeah, we are a people heavy industry, which is the thing that makes us kind of technology laggards, but also protects us from AI.
It sounds like Nick, Rob, from actually our team is on this call back here, but he's just put in a comment that for 20 years there's been maybe this counter argument about how much info and data, what all needed to be perfected, and how much of this is revisiting, are these vestiges of of the past that we keep haven't turned on their head, like you said, the process over which technology and how much info that we need to be generating. And you're not just filling time, right? There's maybe some of that, like staying busy for busy's sake isn't the goal. And employees need to understand that, but people on the team need to understand that, like, not just trying to stay busy, we're trying to run a business, right?
Yeah.
Any kind of closing thoughts? Maybe kind of run around the room here, the virtual room. Dan, you kind of kicked this off. Any any just general thoughts about the survey, or maybe even just things that we should work on? Like I said, this was I feel pretty good about it. It was our first time doing it, so, and we're not. I tried to put a claim in the document that we put out that, like, we're not professional surveyors, but this was there wasn't a lot of questions. It was kind of like, do you use this or don't you use it? So there was not a whole lot of ambiguity to at least that part of it, but I think we will over time get better at this and kind of sharpen it up. And any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the survey it's a very valuable industry resources. If for nothing else, it allows firms to benchmark themselves against other firms to see where they're stacking up. I do have a great deal of empathy for these design firms and engineering firms that are trying to get work out the door, and the number of softwares that they have to use, and I wonder in the back of my mind if there's a way we can reduce that number by kind of closing these gaps, or as you and I were talking about, is this gap is the number of softwares just going to astronomically increase with AI as everyone's developing their own applications, right?
Yeah,
so
a whole nother.
And that's something that we could consider measuring.
The whole vibe coding, right? Is what's that going to do? What's that going to end up looking like? Is it going to fix things, or is it going to exacerbate the problems, right?
I mean, it'll close gaps for individual firms, and then what happens to the number of firms or softwares that have to be managed? It's going to be an interesting.
Yeah, Scott, what's your?
Yeah, no, I mean, we're seeing that too. I mean, I think Mark says it on this thing. It's both, right? It's both going to be helpful and truly chaotic, and it's changed just in the last 2 months, right? I mean, there's been just a drastic change, and I think in terms of discussion, I think this AI discussion is truthfully as tired as we all are of it, because of the fundamental shifts that we've seen in the last 2 months. I think it's well worth continuing some of those discussions because they are quite a bit different, and we're seeing it impact our team in a multitude of ways. Some very surprising, actually. Anyway, I don't want to make this an AI discussion, but boy, it's really changing some things.
No, but I think the Confluence, kind of platform, what we've seen is that people in this industry generally are willing to share best practices, what's working, what's not working. And this is a little bit of what we try to do with this forum is, for those that are willing to come out and share, it's like, look, I skinned my knees. You don't have to. Here's what we did. Here's what worked. And I think that's a great part of this industry that people are willing to share. Aaron, any last thoughts?
Real quickly, I guess in all my time, as a practitioner and then at Autodesk and stuff, I never really thought about governance. It's right here on the slide, but I would say it's super important to understand what you have in terms of the quality of your data, where it is, who has access to it, things like that. And then the other thing that kind of came out of just our talk today was this idea of, treating integrations as first-class citizens. Like, that's as important as the actual products you buy, is the ability of these tools to communicate to each other. And so a couple of things I would take away.
All right, Corey, you get 30 seconds, and then Nick gets the last word.
I mean, as I kind of summarize all this in my head, I just think about, I wish as an industry we could reflect on our own business practices with a sustainable mindset around like business sustainability and less waste internally in what we do every day, as much as we are paying attention to being LEED certified and all these other sustainability practices that are going on in the final product. And I think there's a lot of fat that can be trimmed off from these technological tool sets in our organizations. I think we're up against a steep climb with this AI stuff going on and how much distraction and noise is being generated around this right now. I think we're already suffering from trying to herd our little design cats all the time, every day, and it's a challenge. And I think we got a work cut out for us, both on the practice side and on the software engineering side moving forward. It's going to be an interesting time the next 12 to 24 months, for sure.
All right, Nick.
I mean, I appreciate putting the survey together. I thought it was when I filled it out, I was like, I don't know if this is going to be. There's so much information here. I don't know how you're going to parse it, but it came together really well. I've used this as an example to a couple other people and helping put some other surveys together. So kind of looking forward to where that goes and getting a better insight into the industry. But yeah, I would echo what everybody else said of like, it's changed a lot in the last 2 years. It's going to change a lot more in the next 2 years. And the more that we can work together and share, lessons learned, the better we can, the rising tide lifts all boats type thing. And I hope it's not your intellectual property edge about how we translate data back and forth between Rhino and Revit. Like if it is, you should be a software company, not an architectural firm. So how do we use these to produce better buildings and better environments should be our edge, not I'm a better tool user than you.
Well said. So let me use this for those of you that have hung on. Like I said, we under this Confluence umbrella, we do these professional development events. Here's just a couple of pictures. This a couple of years ago. I don't know if you know Mehdi from Egnyte, but we did a whole AI workshop one day, which was very successful, I think, early. This was us in San Francisco last year. There's Bill from Chaos standing up front, and I spy you there, Aaron, sitting out in the audience. But roundtable conversations, just good deep dives, presentations as a group. It's a good time to get out, meet some of your professionals. So like I said, we do this 3-day event every October. It is invite only, but we would invite you to come to the Confluence and get on the list. We are doing these 1-day events, and the next one is coming up soon. It's in Seattle on April 2nd. And Mr. Scott Davidson is going to be one of our presenters there. So very happy to have him participating that day. And then we're going to be in Chicago on May 20th. That's being hosted at SOM. So that should be a really good event. And that space is going to fill up fast. So if you're there in Chicago, we're already making a run on that one. Seattle, we've been a little bit late coming to the table on some of the program, but we should have a good event there as well. And then if you haven't seen it, under the Confluence umbrella, myself, Evan Troxel do a podcast. We're actually just started recording our 3rd season. So there's more episodes starting to be queued up. You'll hear a lot of the interviews in this season. We tend to talk to a lot of the software vendors. So we'll be talking about the tech stack survey and more of this kind of conversation that goes on. So if this is the kind of thing that floats your boat, you're going to want to, tune into those Confluence podcasts when you're on your workouts or morning walks. So appreciate all of that. Thanks for hanging around a few minutes later, and special thanks to Dan, Nick, Corey, Scott, and Aaron. You guys make this easy. I just have to sit back and try to make sure that everything's running. So anyway, thanks everybody. We appreciate it.
Thank you.